Nikos, thank you. We'll move directly to Vicky.
Thank you. Thanks very much for this. However, I think we do indeed have a partisan press right now in the UK. And it's interesting thinking about Greece, which I didn't quite expect your contribution to be quite so moving, actually, about the Greeks. Unfortunately, Greece and its problems was used in the referendum campaign in a very negative way. So it was, look what Europe has done to Greece. Why do you want to look at the mistakes they have made? Look how they've turned this country into a disaster area with such huge loss of GDP. And so why do we want to be part of this failed region, which is declining anyway in terms of its importance to the world? And that sort of feeling took hold. So Greece actually played quite a big role in this, which is rather worrying. And the other thing is that it's interesting what you said about nationalism. Before the Eastern European countries joined, certainly on any map of Europe, you'd see that the most two most nationalistic countries in Europe were Britain and Greece. Of course, both sort of at the edge of Europe, but actually sharing that between them. So, and thinking about immigration and the issue that we're talking about today, which is how you treat migrant labor, if you were to ask the Brits 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, a question about do they want to see less immigration, they would, and you had a referendum, they would all say overwhelmingly yes. So the mood had always been like this, somewhat small changes depending on the period. But generally, there is a concern, has been a concern that perhaps too many people have come here, or come here at any time. And the last expression was against the Europeans, because that was the thing that they were allowed to vote on. But actually, I think it hides underneath that a much greater concern, not so much about the Europeans, but about the wider range of people who come over. And I think the question about what do you do with all those communities in the future is very, very important too. So it is an issue which I think perhaps explains a little bit of what's been going on in terms of the responses of particularly the Conservative Party, but not exclusively the Conservative Party, to the numbers that have come in from Europe, particularly, of course, Eastern Europe, when we opened up our borders much earlier than anyone else in 2004. And we ended up in this position where, of course, the Greeks are equally affected, when, as numbers, we're not particularly large, although probably larger than we think. And it's quite interesting talking to various embassies. We look at what the official figures tell you, in terms of the numbers that are here per nationality, and they tell you that actually the figures are probably twice as large, if not more. I don't know where they are, because of course we have no idea who's here. We don't register anyone. So it is an issue in terms of how we cope with any changes that may happen in the future. So I think it's worth just thinking about migration in a minute for a while, before we go down to what's been proposed at present, because of course, we think that migration, well, rather the campaign was that migration is bad for the economy, whereas in fact, we know from all the studies that have been done, the Office for Budget Responsibility, for example, showing that migration is actually very good for the economy. It increases productivity. We've just had some figures from the Chancellor in his spring statement that showed that actually productivity is not doing very well and is likely to stay very low in the next few years, which also then means low growth in the economy. Well, less migration means less productivity, means less ability to manage one's debt. It means higher deficit to GDP ratio, it means higher debt to GDP ratio. Now, why? Not only the productivity element, of course, which is innovative people coming into the economy. You have a wider range of people to choose from. You don't stop your production because you have problems in terms of labor. You can hire whoever you want. That's very good for businesses. They can expand and so on. And lots of very innovative, clever, skilled people come in and contribute to startups, to the city, and everything else, science and universities. I mean, that goes without saying. But also, very crucially, migrants contribute positively to the finances of the UK's economy, in the sense that they are the only group in the country that makes a positive contribution to the exchequer, in the sense that they give in terms of taxes, more than they take out. Whereas the rest of the economy basically takes more in terms of payments from the state than it actually contributes in revenues. So you reduce that to anywhere below 200,000 net a year, and you have a real problem on your hands. And what is going on right now, of course, is that migration is being reduced. I mean, the latest figures suggest that particularly EU migrants, their numbers have been reduced very significantly, to the point where you begin to wonder whether you are going to reach this 200,000, which 200,000 is all EU and non-EU. And remember, the latest figures for the last year suggest that actually there were more non-EU migrants who came in, where we have complete control, and yet we let them all in, than EU migrants who came in. So already there is a shift, people not being very willing to come in here. There are skill shortages developing in lots of areas, not just high skilled but also low skilled ones. We know that nurses' willingness to even consider a job here, you know, the National Health Service has been going and recruiting from abroad, particularly Eastern Europe, but the interest of nurses they have to sort of tick a little thing and say, yes, I'm interested, I might want to apply. That's dropped by 94% in the last year. I mean, that is huge. So we're already beginning to wonder how some of those posts are going to be filled. So it is an issue, you know, looking ahead, how the system here will cope with all this, and the idea that by having controls, border controls and immigration controls, will mean that we'll keep the low-skilled people out, and therefore wages will rise in the UK. I mean, the reality is that only 1 in 4 migrants who come into the UK from the EU are low-skilled, or at least work in low-skilled areas. And the truth is that as a result of migrants coming in, the skill level in loads of sectors in the economy has gone up, because a number of them have all sorts of qualifications, and yet they may become Uber drivers, although they may have an engineering degree, or they work in shops where they can actually help adapt systems in a way that actually pushes productivity of particular areas up. And the other thing is that you can't necessarily control who wants to come in. It depends on how your economy is doing. They may want to go somewhere else. I mean, after all, Europe, that we thought was a failed region, is in fact growing at the fastest rate in 12 years. And the reason why we're doing reasonably well economically, at least, you know, perhaps 1.5% isn't reasonably well, but at least we are surviving with quite high employment, is because Europe is booming. So, I mean, for the UK, this has been very beneficial, but it also means that people who might come to us, or might have come to us before, may decide, actually, this doesn't really look particularly attractive any longer. So they may decide to go somewhere else. And that is already happening. Plus, of course, the exchange rate, because of Brexit, of course, we may not be doing that badly right now against the dollar, but that's more a Trump issue. If you look against the euro, we are still as low as we were after the referendum, the shock devaluation that took place at the time. So I mean, all these issues suggest that there needs to be a serious rethink of how this migration policy works. And in fact, there almost has been. It's quite interesting that the government has asked the Migration Advisory Committee to look at the economics of migration, as if we haven't done it 1,500 times already. And they are not going to report until the autumn. Now think of the autumn. This is near the October date, which is when really we should have decided what we're doing, certainly with the transition period, and have a withdrawal agreement that needs somehow or other to tell you what we're going to be doing beyond the transition period. Now, of course, Joe, who was here before, is keeping his fingers crossed. The transition period will last forever. fine. I mean, that would be really great. Now, of course, the Europeans have said today, or rather, they had said already, and we today said, yes, we accept that. The actual transition period would finish by the end of 2020, so even less than 2 years. Now, as Joe was saying, anything could happen. We could have another election at some point. There could be a real problem with the withdrawal bill, with the trade bill, all those bills that I meant, the migration bill, all those things which haven't quite come back yet are being very, very slowly going through the process, the Parliament and the Lords, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And they could be thrown out at any point. And there are loads more amendments now being put to allow for greater consideration over this. So there is a lot of uncertainty at present in terms of what or where we might end up. But nevertheless, there is a sort of legal framework that is being developed because, you remember, there was an agreement in December 2017, and that agreement said, between the EU and the UK, that those people, all the Greeks, of course, were here, who've exercised their free movement rights before the Brexit date, remember the Brexit date being March 29, 2019. Of course, there could be an extension of Article 50, which is the official letter we've sent to say we want, which allows for 2 years for us exiting. There could be an extension of that. That's another thing which surprisingly Joe didn't mention, but lots of other people are talking about that. But let's put that aside. Otherwise, if it were to happen, so all those who've exercised their free movement rights before Brexit Day and wish to continue to stay in this country, of course, they will have the right to apply for settled status. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be here. They have to have been here, and they can apply for a settled status, which of course needs to be defined a little bit more, and we're discussing that earlier with the embassy in terms of what it actually means. So what it means broadly is that their existing rights will be preserved, or broadly reserved, which will include access to things like healthcare, other benefits, etc. So they'll be like a UK citizen. But it doesn't mean that all rights are going to be preserved. In particular, there is an issue of whether people who are already resident here will in the future have the right to bring in spouses without any concern or any other family members. So that could be restricted, and that's something that is being negotiated, will have to be negotiated before the withdrawal agreement is put to bed. But it will incorporate these provisions in legal form. So we already are moving towards getting to a point where that will happen and will be written into our national law. And that's how things are moving. And there will be enforcement through our national courts here. But in practice, I think the general belief is that we are still going to be paying attention and follow the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. So there is an agreement that this will happen. And remember, we have this 8-year period during which the European Court of Justice will still be able to say or to act on behalf of EU citizens here if they feel that their rights haven't been properly fulfilled. Now, is it going to be 8 years, as the agreement said in December? It could be longer. We could have a different government. I mean, this is a negotiable one, even though it could be written down as something that needs to be followed, but it could actually change. But settled status, of course, is quite an interesting one. We don't quite know exactly how it will apply, but the government here has said it will try to apply it in a simple way. It will be affordable. It will be quite cheap for people to apply for it. It won't be as complicated as now. So anyone who had applied for citizenship before, just forget it, and they may have all to reapply again, of course, but it's going to be simple, supposedly. It won't require these tons of documentation that we had before, and so on. So at least there's some movement to put in some sort of legal form what will be happening post-Brexit. But actually, it isn't really settled because there's quite a lot of concerns that one may have, because, of course, in anything to do with immigration law, the devil is in the detail. Anyone who's been involved in this will tell you, and Joe would have told you this if he was here. So everything will need to be translated into a legal text. And there are a number of things I already touched on. The family rights, for example. So they need to be specified in the withdrawal agreement so that the UK can't deny those rights for people. I mean, so far, unfortunately, if you look at non-EU, the UK's record is dreadful in this. So that's something that needs to be looked at and should allow as much flexibility as possible so that it can also be contested. Then what the administrative procedures are for getting settled status. It's so that the commitments of the UK themselves are meaningful and enforceable. And then, of course, the independent national authority which will monitor the implementation of the agreement. Now, how is it going to be run? Is it going to be generally independent? So all these things need to be sorted out. And then there's the whole issue of sickness, comprehensive sickness insurance. I mean, my niece has been here for years studying and working. And then we realized that certainly as things were, because she didn't have comprehensive private health insurance, all her years here didn't qualify her for citizen status, which is quite odd. I think that has now supposedly been thrown out. If you look at what was discussed in December, the UK government has made a commitment that this requirement will be waived, but it isn't yet in the withdrawal agreement itself. So another thing that needs to be watched. Well, that's for the longer term. Now, just quickly on the transition period, which is a really important one. I mean, we begged for it because basically we're not ready at all. I don't think anyone, frankly, had any idea how difficult the whole thing would be when they were suggesting to people that, yes, it will be brilliant when we leave and we'll take back control immediately. We're not taking back control. We're basically giving all the control to the EU. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not a particularly pleasant position to be in. What the government has said, nevertheless, is that free movement will end after Brexit. So transition period, nevertheless, means even though free movement will end after Brexit 2019, of course, it's not ending at all. The existing frameworks of rules and regulations, I'm quoting this now because this comes from the statement, will apply during any transition period. And if you look, I mean, we talked about the acquis when Joe was here. The position of the Commission and the European Parliament is that the full application of the acquis must be enforced during any transition period. So ECJ and everything else, all that is there. So the question is, how do you reconcile the two positions? Well, I mean, we obviously have accepted that it will operate as is now. So that's good news for any Greek who is here. But the question still is, are there going to be different rules for anyone who comes after Brexit Day? Not very clear. Now, we heard Theresa May say at one point recently that actually, yes, it will. The transition, it will be exactly the same. They have the same rights when they come. And it's one of the points that the Commission is going to insist on. Good news if they win, because I think that makes a huge amount of sense. Otherwise, you end up with this incredible thing. I mean, just imagine what you do with all the European citizens afterwards. I mean, the truth is that right now there is control, if you like, in the sense that everyone goes through passport control when they come in. So, and you can register people if you want to. But let's assume that people register after Brexit date. So you have the people who registered and people who haven't registered. Then you have people who get settled status and people who don't have settled status. People who come during the transition period, or people who've been here for some time, went out, came back, and have to prove that they were here before. It sounds nightmarish. We're not very good at bureaucracy. We don't know how many people we've got in this country. We haven't got a clue. But for a long period of time, we weren't taking any notice of who was coming in, who was going out. And we've only done it for security reasons. So bureaucracy will increase, or will supposedly. As it is, we're having great difficulty coping with what we've got at present. And there will be huge confusion as to where you belong. Who goes and registers, who doesn't, how long have you been here, can you prove anything? And if we're really seriously saying that the documentation is going to be very simple in the future, anything that differentiates people quite so much is not going to lead to any clarity at all. So, nevertheless, we have this transition period. It may last forever. And Jonathan Portes, who isn't here, but I'm doing his little bit, has sent this little note to me about what the worst case and the best case scenario is. If I can just read that quickly, then we'll get into the time. So, the best case is that the withdrawal agreement is agreed in October. We have to do that because then everyone has to vote for it. And it's signed in March, okay, before we leave. So the Home Office puts in place new, much more user-friendly registration system. And very little changes really for EU citizens here now. Now, of course, there isn't really any registration system except for non-EU. But there will be a registration system. It's not that difficult to do. And the transition period means everything goes smoothly. Okay, this is his best case scenario. This is Jonathan dreaming right now. And the UK and the EU then negotiate a long-term deal which allows continued labour mobility, even if not free movement, after 2021, so that strong links continue. Now, of course, this is quite likely, frankly, because lots of people come in freely and then only really need a permit from non-EU when they start working. So what you can do to cut down the bureaucracies, you can pass all the work for it to firms, to organizations, who then have to apply for whatever visa it is that you need. And frankly, it can be made quite simple if you want to, and continue having this preferential hiring thing for EU people too. It's not beyond the possibility that we could achieve. So that's the best case scenario. So we end up more or less, with EU citizens as preferred citizens who come in easily and get jobs without us worrying about it. Then you wonder, why on earth did we do any of this at all? The worst case is that talks break down. Of course, it matters a lot in terms of people who come in, but it also matters hugely about the economy more generally. And the question then is, does anyone really want to come and work here, frankly? But anyway, by March 19, there is no signed withdrawal agreement. This doesn't mean EU citizens living here will be deported or lose their jobs. Well, who knows? But Jonathan believes, and I think it's right, and it's a shame that Joy isn't here, that they will be protected because all the relevant directives form part of UK law. And remember, we're bringing them all in to the UK law structure. That's the process of this. We're basically importing everything that we were doing under EU, and then we decide which ones to keep and which ones we won't. But there will be a sort of policy limbo if this is were to happen, and it would go on a long time, and the political tension could be rising, and that actually is very, very uncertain for anybody who is here. And the relationship with the EU is very bad, is the way he put it. Actually, that's pretty constrained by Jonathan. And EU citizens here would be caught in the crossfire, and it's for you guys to decide whether you want to be bothered staying in this place or not. Let's hope that Greece and its economy picks up very strongly in the meantime. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Vicky.